those takes at the time. Dr. Bennett has his doctorate in philosophy. He is now pretty much devoted to his research on the historical basis of Reich's life and work, and has published a number of recent articles. Today he's going to talk on a very fascinating subject, which is very, very little known, was Reich's role in and contact with the Soviet Union in the Bolshevik revolution, and the material the experience that led to Reich's warning of the inevitable failure of the Bolshevik Revolution, which turns out to be part of the sexual revolution, and turns out to be incredibly accurate. Dr. Philip Bennett. And then we'll have a round table for those of you who stick around. People are just fading fast.
Harry just doesn't come out of my hour.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I hate to disappoint Harry Lewis. Too loud? Oh, yeah, turn that.
No, he's feeding back.
Still feedback. Let's try something. I actually don't need this mic. I actually don't need the mic.
We can hear you fine.
Yeah, I know. Can we? I'm going to talk without a mic. Okay?
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
I've also found that projecting is a good way to deal with anxiety. Get it. So hi. I'm going to disappoint Harry Lewis and perhaps Henry Lothan. I'm not going to talk about Reich and Trotsky, but maybe that'll come up in the discussion. I'm only going as far as 1929. Reich and Trotsky do in fact meet, but that's in 36. So I've written about that. Read that stuff. What follows is a highly selective history of psychoanalysis in Russia, both before and after the revolution, and then Reich's trip to Russia, and then the consequences of his involvement with Marxism and communism. So, psychoanalysis begins in Imperial Russia with a guy named Nikolai Osipov, who discovered Freud's, someone else did this earlier, mixing up Reich and Freud, who discovered Freud's writings in 1907. And in 1908, Osipov wrote in Russian a survey article of everything that Freud had written up to that point. So this was a massive task. In 1910, Osipov visited Freud, and I think he was the first student of psychoanalysis to do that. Sabina Spielrein. Is it Spielrein? Spielrein. Sabina Spielrein came to Vienna to meet Freud in 1911, and Tatiana Rosenfeld in 1912, but Osipov was there in 1910. And also in 1910, together with Nikolai Grupov, he began a journal called Psychotherapy, and soon the overwhelming majority of articles in this journal were on psychoanalysis. And what's significant about that is that Freud's own yearbook only started a couple of years before that. In 1911, Osipov began the Russian Psychoanalytic Society, and that's the same year that A.A. Brill founded the New York Psychoanalytic Society in 1911. So you can see that a lot was happening in Russia at the time. There were other Russians involved with psychoanalysis, but mostly outside of Russia. So there was a guy named Moishe Wolf who spent time in Berlin and studied with Carl Abraham. Sabina Spielrein was Carl Jung's patient and protege, a woman who looks remarkably like Keira Knightley. Some of you may be going to look. There's an interesting film called The Dangerous Method, where Keira Knightley plays Sabina Spielrein with her jaws sticking out.
Not exactly historically accurate.
She was in Zurich, of course, though she did return to Moscow in 1923, and Tatiana Rosenfeld also studied medicine in Zurich. And I want to say a little something about those two women, because they're both very important. First, Tatiana Rosenfeld. Not many of you have probably heard of her. In 1905, she was active in the 1905 revolution, the one that brought about a modification of the monarchy in Imperial Russia as part of a Jewish workers group. And in 1906, she began studying medicine in Zurich. And somewhere in there, early in her medical training, she discovered Freud. And later, she was reported to have said, "What harmony results when one brings together the ideas of Freud and Marx?" This was reported by a Roman psychoanalyst, Sarah Nittich, who wrote Rosenfeld's obituary. It's not clear when she said this, but it very well may have been before Alfred Adler gave his lecture, The Psychology of Marxism, to the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in 1909. And we can't really tell because Adler's lecture was lost. So we don't know the content of that lecture and whether he talks about bringing Marx and Freud together in harmony or in some other way. In 1912, Rosenfeld lived in Vienna. She attended, were they called the Wednesday night meetings in 1912, that early? She attended the Wednesday night meetings along with Sabina Spielrein, and that was the first time Russian was heard in Freud's chambers, when the two women would talk among themselves. And in 1917, she returned to Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. As for Sabina Spielrein, it sounds so German. She was Russian.
No, it's the proper.
It's a proper Spielrein. Okay.
Even the relative who's now living here, Sabina Spielrein, spelled differently, also found
Spielrein. Okay.
Our Russian psychiatrist here, Phil, says it's because she was Jewish.
Yeah, no, I know she was Jewish.
That's why she had that name.
There was
But it
also
sounds so
Russia
German. But in any case,
the
forget about
Russians
her
had a
name.
big connection with Germany.
Forget her name. We'll call her Sabina. In 1911, she completed her medical training, and that same year, she published her paper on schizophrenia in the Freud's, well, the journal was edited by Jung, her former doctor, in the Otto book. And in 1912, Spielrein published an article called Destruction as the Origin of Coming into Being, which many, including Freud, indicates that this was the first speculation about the definite state. And Freud acknowledges Spielreich when he goes on to develop this. Soviet Russia became an admired site of revolution in the arts and societies, despite the devastation of the First World War, over 3 million killed, and the horrors of the post-revolution Civil War. And here are some of the changes that occurred right after the Bolshevik Revolution. And I list them because they were all very impressive to Wilhelm Reich. First, at the time of the revolution, there was complete equality of men and women. Marriage became very easy to dissolve. When you got married, you filled out a card. When you no longer wanted to be married, you ripped up the card. There was no such thing as an illegitimate child or child born out of wedlock, which I always find a very interesting expression. Homosexuality was decriminalized, at least in Russia, not in all the Soviet republics, but in Russia. And abortion in 1920 was made completely legal under all circumstances. So the Soviets were light years ahead of the Marxist Social Democratic Party in Vienna and the Weimar Republic in Germany. Both places where Reich lived, and in both places Reich campaigned for the decriminalization of homosexuality and for the legalization of abortion. Later, under Stalin, this is going to change. It's going to change dramatically. And Reich writes, so really there's I would suggest a shift from Bolshevism to Stalinism. Reich writes in 1936, the original title was Sexuality and the Cultural Struggle on a Socialist Restructuring of Man. When I got translated into English, it became the Sexual Revolution. Part 2 of the Sexual Revolution, those of you who read it, know it's devoted to what he calls the struggle for a new life in the Soviet Union, and here he analyzes the backpedaling of all of those radical changes that were just right after the revolution, where abortion was again made illegal, but homosexuality was recriminalized, at least male homosexuality. Lesbianism has never been against the law in Soviet Russia. That didn't stop them from the rest of the Pussy Riot, but that was a whole other story. In any case.
That's because of the music.
Psychoanalysis under Bolshevism was actually quite thriving. But I'm going to limit myself to talking about children and child rearing. In the fall of 1920, Tatiana Rosenfeld established a separate school for children with neurotic problems and learning disabilities, which is affiliated with the Brain Pathology Institute in what was then Petrograd. It's now St. Petersburg, but it went from being Petrograd to Leningrad after Lenin died. And when I first visited, it was Leningrad, and now it's back to being St. Petersburg. It's believed that Rosenfeld's school in St. Petersburg inspired Vera Schmidt for her school in Moscow. Now, in one article I read, when it came to Vera Schmidt, the author began by talking about Otto Schmidt. So, this is a bit sexist. He's supposed to be writing about Vera Schmidt, he's talking about Otto. But actually, her marriage to Otto Schmidt in 1913 probably made all the difference. If not, I think Vera Yanitskaya would have just been another person in Russia who had read Freud in the original and was interested in education and psychoanalysis. But Otto Schmidt was a monk. He was a mathematician. When Wright speaks of him, Wright says he was an explorer, but he was a lot more than an explorer. He was a mathematician. He did lead polar explorations, but he was also the vice president of the Academy of Science. He headed the state publishing house. He was the chief editor of the great Soviet encyclopedia which, by the way, has an entry on Reich from 1933, and it's not a very flattering entry. He was the head of the Soviet Psychoanalytic Institute, and that's the more important point here. And he's considered in Soviet textbooks as a hero of the Soviet Union. Now, I don't know what he's like in current textbooks, since we no longer have this.
There are no current textbooks.
Vera Schmidt is mainly remembered for her work with the Children's Home, to which we'll turn in a moment. She was a member of the Soviet Psychoanalytic Society, eventually its recording secretary, and wrote up reports about psychoanalysis in the Soviet Union for the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, the last one being in 1930, by which time psychoanalysis as a movement was pretty much over in Russia. In 1924, Vera Schmidt publishes Psychoanalytic Education in Soviet Russia, a report about the lab school in Moscow. It was published by Freud's press, the International Psychoanalytic Vera, in 1924. It's available in German and in French. It was never published in Russian. This brings us to the Children's Home. Am I going too fast?
No, you're fine.
The volume is okay.
Yeah.
The volume's not okay.
No, it's fine.
Well, wait, it's not okay for you.
Just a little loud.
Or maybe a few rows.
Okay.
But I mean, I could talk about it. Of the Children's Home, that sounds too of the Children's Home in Reich's Sexual Revolution, he says that it was the first attempt in the history of education to give practical content to the theory of infantile sexuality. The school opened in 1921, Detski Dom, Children's Home, but it was also called the Psychoanalytic Orphanage Laboratory, and later International Solidarity. The reason for that last name, International Solidarity, at one point it started to get money from Germany. It was mainly funded by the state, as were all institutions in the Soviet Union. But when it got financial support, they changed the name of it. Officially, it was called the Psychoanalytic Orphanage Laboratory, but it was not an orphanage. That is, the parents of these children were very much alive. One of the children was Otto Schmidt's and Vera Schmidt's son. Another one was a guy named Vasilis, well, I don't know what his last name was then, but Stalin's son. I mean, I have trouble saying Stalin's real name, and I don't know if his son was Vasily Stalin or Vasily Degorovich, however you say that name. What was it? Thank you. The Georgian name. So Vasily was known by his father's original name? Is that the idea?
Yes.
Okay. And Stalin was known by his nom de guerre, Stalin. The former leaders of the school were two psychoanalysts, Ermakov and Wolf, who I mentioned earlier, but actually the school was run by Vera Schmidt. The reason her name didn't appear on the heading of the school was that she did not have a medical degree. But she did all the day-to-day activities, was responsible for the school's theoretical orientation, etc. The Children's Home was attached to the Russian Psychoanalytic Institute, which Otto Schmidt headed. It was essentially a psychoanalytic home for young children, ages 2 to 4, of the party Nomenklatura, that is the high muckety-mucks of the Communist Party and the leaders of other organizations. The home was one of 5 branches of the Psychoanalytic Institute. Another branch was an outpatient clinic run by Sabina Spielmann. She also worked at the school. She came back to Moscow in 1923. It began with somewhere like a couple of dozen children. The sources vary. And here is from Vera Schmidt's report. Great attention was devoted to the sexual life of the children. Since it was assumed that many of their actions were motivated by the unconscious quest for sexual gratification, the children were permitted to express themselves and interact with others freely as long as no physical harm was evident. They were closely supervised. The children were warmly supported by the staff in the belief that the manner in which the infant experiences his or her very rich sexual life will determine to a large extent the presence or absence of serious sexual and sexually derived problems later as adults. I think you translated this. Did you translate this? I don't think so. You translated this one. Someone must. Now the vision was that everyone working at the school would undergo psychoanalysis, but this never happened. And after a while, the school began to shrink in size. Originally, it had a staff of 50, and then it shrunk down to 18, and it ended up there were only 12 kids in the school. In April 1923, some state agency inspected the school and gave it an unfavorable rating. And soon after, in September 1923, Vera and Otto came to Vienna. They met Freud. They spoke at the Psychoanalytic Society. And I assume that's when they met Reich. Reich had to have met them because later when Reich goes to Moscow, he lives with them for 6 weeks. And it's just hard for me to imagine putting him up for 6 weeks if they didn't know together. In July 1924, 7 of the staff members write a letter to Otto Schmidt, and Vera was one of them. And they said, you know, we're in way over our heads. We don't know how to handle the transference. We need analysis. We need further training, especially concerning the sexual behavior of the children. And by 1925, the school was closed. But it had a very interesting life. And reading the whole of this report is fascinating. It's just worth noting that at least up to around 1925, there are ways in which the Russians were really kind of ahead of the curve here, or at least up to the curve. I'm not sure what that expression means. But, you know, they had a journal very early on. I don't know when the first American journal started, devoted to psychoanalysis. But they had a journal as early as 1910. They had a society the same year as the New York Psychoanalytic Society. They had the children's home that I was just talking about. It opened the same year that Neil opened his first progressive school in Hillerau, the garden city of Hillerau, outside of Dresden. And in 2013, I visited that place and took a bunch of pictures. But I decided not to. And, you know, just as the first outpatient clinic that was mentioned earlier, the ambulatorium in Vienna, the first one was in Berlin in 1920 under Abraham. Then came the Vienna Free Clinic in 1922. Well, the Moscow Free Clinic was in 1923. So they were really up there, so to say. And then again, the Soviet Psychoanalytic Society was accepted into the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1923. Now, yes, what?
Yeah, could you say a quick word about the disintegration of the children's home, or why that happened?
Vera Schmidt herself closed it, because she just felt that they just couldn't handle things.
Okay.
It wasn't closed by the state. Wright was very clear about pointing that out. And if you want to read Wright's analysis, he devotes 5 pages in the second part of the Sexual Revolution to discussing the home. But the whole second half of the Sexual Revolution really tells you his impressions of the changes that came as we moved from Bolshevism to Stalinism.
Does she say, like, you know, what actually happened that was like, oh my God, we can't deal with this? There was any hints?
He just said that.
Something like that.
Oh,
Okay. So, as you know, Lenin has a series of strokes, and by 1923, Lenin is kaput. He dies in 1924. There's a bit of a power struggle, but very quickly, Stalin is taking control.
A bit of a power struggle.
A bit of a power struggle. Trotsky gets thrown out of the party in 1927 and gets thrown out of the country in 1929. Stalin takes over. Beginning around 1924, debate begins in Russian scholarly journals over the compatibility of Freud and Marx. And there's a series of articles, all with the same title, Freudianism and Marxism. So the first one is by Aaron Zolkin. In Reich's writings, he always spells this guy's name with an S. And I'm not sure if that's from German interpretation of Russian or whatever, but his name is commonly spelled Zolkin with a Z. And initially, Zolkin was a supporter of psychoanalysis. But and he writes this article attempting to show a compatibility between psychoanalysis and Marxism. Uranets, in the fall of 1924, writes an article with the exact same title. And in it, he says, Freudian theory is utterly incompatible with Marxist philosophy. In 1926, Sapir, S-A-P-I-R, not the American linguist Edward Sapir, this is Ivan Sapir. Oh, it's I don't know what his first name was, but I'm guessing Ivan, because in Russia there's only 5 male names. This guy, Sapir, writes another article called Freudianism and Marxism. It's published under the banner of Marxism, which is sort of their theoretical journal. And among other things, Sapir argued that sexualism as a universal doctrine of the human psyche, that's a quote, was exaggerated and empirically unfounded in Freud's work. So already you're seeing a turn against psychoanalysis here. Some of us are. Could one person find it? Is Adrian in the booth? Adrian, are you there? No. Maybe it can be turned down again. Apparently it's either on or off. Sarah. But no lighting of small fires. In 1927, Voloshinov writes a book called Freudianism. It's no longer an article. And in it, there's a chapter called a critique of Marxist apologies of Freudianism. And Voloshinov says that there's an overestimation of sexuality, and he openly attacks Zolkin, Alexander Luria, and others. Some scholars think that this book was actually written by Bakhtin and published by Voloshinov, but who the heck knows? In response, Luria resigns as secretary of the Russian Psychoanalytic Society. Zolkin begins distancing himself, and along with Sapir, becomes very critical of Reich when Reich speaks in Moscow. So by the time Reich gets to Moscow, and this is either August or September 1929, Reich, in one of his autobiographical works, says September. A lot of people say August. I don't know. It doesn't quite matter. But by the time he gets there, the climate is quite chilly. But now this raises an important question. Why did he go to Moscow in the first place? I mean, why was he interested in going to Moscow? And so here I'm going to backtrack a bit and talk a bit about Reich's the development of his social and political thinking. And as I said, this is a highly selective history, so I'm going to skip the usual stuff, but fortunately, my 3 learned colleagues have already said a lot about this, so I don't have to say it. Reich's first reference to social change and the importance of social change is in the very last paragraph of The Impulsive Character. And I wish we had more time for Jonathan Koblenzer and I to analyze it, but you'll see in it an allusion to the very lecture you talked about in 1918, where Freud talks about bringing psychoanalysis to the masses. Reich actually quotes that lecture in that last paragraph. He doesn't give it a footnote, but he quotes Freud's lecture. In 1926, as sorry for me not to pull your street, as Henry Lothan has said, in 1926, Wright finishes the manuscript for the original function of the orgasm and gave a copy to Freud on the 70th birthday. In the following year, it's published by the International Psychoanalytic Association. The final chapter of the original function of the orgasm is called The Social Significance of Genital Strivings. And here, for the first time, we see an explicit use of Marxist language and thinking in Reich's writings. Here's one example. Who has a good voice to tell me that I need a drink? The Russians know how to make good vodka. Let us now shift our attention to an examination of the current sexual morality as represented by traditional capitalist middle-class society. This sexual morality, although rooted in the views and interests of the economically well-to-do and the aristocracy, reaches far beyond these circles and thrives especially in those of minor civil servants, employers, and the petty bourgeoisie. Nor is the urban proletariat free of it, and one can observe that proletarians adopt bourgeois sexual morality to the extent that their lifestyle assimilates that of the petty bourgeoisie. Now, he wrote that in 1927. In 1945, he revisited this text, and eventually the Trust published it under the title Genitality, so as not to confuse it with the third edition of Sexual Function of the Orgasm. But this is in the text that he went over, so he didn't edit this out. And it's very interesting to compare the original with the later version, and I'm doing that in my book. So here you have an explicit use of Marxist lingo. Proletarian, petty bourgeoisie, talking about different economic classes, and later in this chapter, he explicitly references Marxist principles. There's a bad translation of this in the Journal of Ergonomy where it said, as Marx said, and I went back to the German, it never said that. Rather, Reich said, as Marxist principles would indicate. So the Journal of Ergonomy wanted to make it more radical than he was enough. In any case, as Dr. Lothan pointed out, in late 1926, Reich contracts tuberculosis. It was called the Viennese disease. Large numbers of people in Vienna got tuberculosis. Large numbers of them died. He goes to the Magic Mountain at Davos. He returns to Vienna in time to witness firsthand the police riot on July 15th, 1927. This is Reich's politicizing moment, the event that got him from his office and treatment room into the streets. He had already been reading Marx. Early on, he was totally apolitical. Mary Higgins points this out in her introduction to Beyond Psychology, that Reich showed no interest in politics. But he started to read Marx in 1926. Then comes the events of July 15th, 1927. Now, to understand these events, you need to know a little bit of Austrian history very quickly. It won't be on the exam. The Social Democratic Workers' Party was anti-Bolshevik. It believed in a gradual transition or evolution to socialism through democratic means. It was in control of Red Vienna. And Vienna was the largest socialist city in the world. And you go there today and you can see the remnants of this, like in housing. You go to Karl Marx, fantastic place. I visited more than once. Vienna had a good deal of autonomy within Austria. It also had a third of the country's population. After the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria was shrunk to this little thing with only 6 million people. 2 million of them lived in Vienna, 10% of whom were Jewish. But Jews were far in excess of positions of leadership, medicine, law, and the like. In any case, the main opposition to the Social Democrats were the Christian socialists. And for some reason, in the translations of Reich's People in Trouble, they're called Christian socialists. That's not their name, they're Christian socialists. And the Christian socials at that time were headed by a Jesuit priest called Ignaz Seppel. So you had, the parliament was right-wing, and Seppel was also the chancellor. So you had a right-wing parliament, but where was it? Well, it was in Vienna, which was the capital of the country. So you had a right-wing parliament housed in a socialist city. You had the head of the right-wing party, a vicious anti-Semite, Seppel, and the Social Democrats were, all the leadership was Jewish, and most of the leadership was Jewish. Otto Bauer's sister was Dora. Right. Yes, that's she.
That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's very interesting that, you know, well, also Freud treated Otto Bauer and Dora's father, who was syphilitic. Another story. In any case, so you have the makings of obvious conflict. By the way, the Schutzbund was a militia attached to the Social Democratic Workers' Party. Each political party had their own army, their own militia. On January 30th, in 1927, during the demonstration by Social Democrats, it wasn't in Vienna, it was in the countryside. Some World War I veterans were in a tavern, and the Social Democrats were demonstrating, and they just fired into the crowd. And they wounded a number of people. They killed a child and a member of the Schutzbund. They were tried in Vienna, and on July 14th, they were acquitted. The morning of July 15th, the news of their acquittal appears in the Social Democratic newspaper, the Arbeiter Zeitung, and the party did not say, the Social Democratic Party did not encourage people to demonstrate, but quite spontaneously, when workers read about the acquittal, they poured into the streets. Then Otto Bauer does something which really annoyed, we can use the vernacular, pissed Reich off tremendously. Otto Bauer sent the Schutzbund to its barracks because he was afraid that if the Schutzbund were present, civil war would break out. So the Schutzbund is removed, and the demonstrators are marching on the Palace of Justice, or from their point of view, the Palace of Injustice. The police start shooting. The demonstrators, the workers burn down the Palace of Justice, and ultimately about 100 people are killed and about 1,000 are wounded. Wright witnesses all of this, hiding behind a tree while bullets are flying around, and he writes about this in chapter 2 of People in Trouble. The very next day, Reich secretly joined the Communist Party. But he remained publicly a member of the Social Democratic Party. Why did he join the Communist Party? Well, from his autobiographical writings, it seems that the main motivation is he was completely frustrated with the Social Democrats and their continual capitulation to the Christian socialists. They're continually compromising with the Christian socialists and compromising away their rights, all in an effort to avoid a civil war. Well, those of you who know Austrian history know that the Civil War eventually did come, albeit briefly. And it is significant that Reich dedicated the mass psychology of fascism, quote, to the fallen Austrian fighters for a socialist future. In December 1928, Reich, together with the communist physician Marie Frischhoff, whose brother actually did go to Russia in 1921 and wrote about what he saw there from the International Psychoanalytic Journal. In December 1928, together with communist physician Marie Frischhoff, Wright founded the Socialist Society for Sex Counseling and Research. I'll call it SGSS, after its German name. This was announced in the daily Social Democratic newspaper, but it was also announced in the Rote Fahne, which was the organ of the Communist Party, the red banner, or red flag, the red banner, I guess, in January 1929. The SGSS marks the beginning of what Reich would later call Sexpol, here meaning an organization that brought together a commitment to a liberatory human sexuality, one freed of religious moralism and patriarchal monogamy, but where full sexual freedom was seen as achievable only within the context of the end of capitalist exploitation. That is, an organization that brought together sexuality and socialism. The SGSS had a three-point program. Free clinics, and they opened sexual counseling centers for workers and salaried employees, public lectures and pamphlets, and then also scientific research. These free clinics can be, when people read that, it can be possibly misleading. You might think there was an office. Rather, what it was is that 8 people set aside an hour in their own treatment rooms and said, you can come, and we'll treat you for free. So it wasn't like you went to a particular, you went to their practicing officers.
Quickly, I'd like to add that even here, Reich was following Freud, because there was an essay in 1908, Civilized Sexual Morality, which is a 6th political idea.
This is a helpful reminder. The SGSS published 3 different books. The first is Reich's Sexual Expectation and Sexual Satisfaction. This is one of the few major works of Reich that has never been published in English. It's the largest selling of all of his publications while he was alive, and it was the first of his publications to be banned. And it also plays an interesting role in Reich's response to the complaint in 1954, but I can't get into that now. In 1930, the SGSS published a pamphlet written by Annie Pinkwright and Marie Frischhoff on abortion. And in 1930, they also published Adolescence, Abstinence, Marital Morality, a criticism of bourgeois sexual reform. This is the first part of the sexual revolution. So we now come to Reich's trip to Moscow. He and Annie Pinkwright, who was also a member of the Communist Party, and also a psychoanalyst, and as pointed out, an official of his organization at one point, they traveled to Moscow, lived with the Schmidts for 6 weeks, and while there, Reich lectured at least in 2 different places. But his main lecture was at the Communist Academy. Together, they visited factories, schools, kindergartens. Some of the flavor of this visit can be seen if you read that second half of the Sexual Revolution, where he discusses Vera Schmidt's children's home and other aspects of Soviet life. Reich did not fail to note the poverty and other consequences of the First World War and the Civil War. He also was quite aware of sexual puritanism, which to him seemed very similar, if not identical, to that which is in Central Europe. But at the time, he didn't draw the obvious implications of this. Obvious, that is, in light of his own understanding of psychoanalysis. His formal description of his trip and his understanding of the state of psychoanalysis in the Soviet Union is in this article published in the Psychoanalytic Movement. So he goes in September or August, comes back, publishes this article, but also, more importantly, he lectures on this in Freud's chambers the 6th of November, 1929. And here, His main point in this report to his psychoanalytic colleagues is to distinguish what he calls psychoanalysis from what he calls Freudism. And Freudism is a term that was used a lot in the Russian literature. For Reich, psychoanalysis is a therapeutic approach towards addressing neuroses. It's a clinical practice. Psychoanalysis understood, as Reich understood it, that is, that holds to the early position that neuroses has a sexual origin, psychoanalysis that rejects the death instinct. And this view of psychoanalysis also has implications for the prevention of neuroses. And this was of great concern to the Soviets. They were very much interested in mass prophylaxis. So Wright gives this talk on November 6th. On December 12th, according to the Functional Orgasm, he gives his final talk in Freud's chambers, in Freud's rooms, and it's on the prophylaxis of neuroses, how to prevent neuroses. So this is very much on his mind. So psychoanalysis is a clinical practice. In contrast, Freudism is an all-encompassing theory, what some scholars today would call a meta-narrative, that, or so the Soviets maintained, as Wright reports, that conflicts with the other meta-narrative, Marxism. What the Soviets objected to were attempts to explain social institutions like religion, totem and taboo, or civilization as a whole. Well, religion, the future of an illusion, totem and taboo. Civilization as a whole, civilization as discontent. These works were available to the Russians. I mean, Totem and Taboo was translated into Russian in 1913. Future of an Illusion, which Freud published in 1927, was translated into Russian the very next year. If I understand things correctly, these speculative works of Freud's are, for Reich and the Soviets, not examples of empirical science and fall under the heading of idealist philosophy, an indulgence for which good dialectical materialists have no time or patience. Reich argued that psychoanalysis was a helpful accompaniment to Marxist sociology, and that psychoanalysis understood as a worldview, Freudianism, had to be rejected. The following year, after this report, Moishe Wolf, who had left Moscow in 1927 and went back to Berlin, he published a rejoinder, and you can read it. If you can read German, you can read it. Its tone is highly polemical, and Wolf doesn't really address Reich's distinction between psychoanalysis and Freudism, but simply makes fun of it and says, if Reich is right, Freud himself is not really doing psychoanalysis. In addition to Reich's own comments in his published work and in his archival material, my main sources on psychoanalysis in the Soviet Union, Martin Miller and Alexander Etkind, write of Reich's visit. Here were actually, I consulted a lot more, but here are 4 sources that I used in preparing this. Etkind is the best, I think, or else it would be impossible. Martin Miller is okay, but it's not as good as Etkind. Svi has written a very good article about Sabine, well, more than one. He's written, I think, 4 or 5 articles about Sabine Spielmann, but this is the one I read initially. And Galina Kristeva has written a very good piece about Osipov and his correspondence.
May I recommend one more?
Pardon me?
May I recommend one more article?
Sure.
Which supersedes this one here.
Oh, one more of your articles.
Right. Which is from 1999 in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, unpublished letters of Sabine Spielmann and CGO.
Yeah. Did you all hear that? Svi wrote this article about the correspondence, these unpublished letters, which, if I recall correctly, argues against the popular view that there was a sexual relationship between Spielmann and Jung.
Not only this, the main argument also is that whereas the Atlas have created a myth that there was a crossing of boundaries during psychoanalysis nonsense, because she was not his patient at that time.
Right. You know, she stopped being his patient in 1906, as I recall.
1905.
1905. In addition to Reich's material, I mean, these things I consulted. Reich's main lecture was entitled Psychoanalysis as a Natural Scientific Branch of Knowledge. And it was given at the Communist Academy, which is not the Academy of Sciences. In an earlier iteration, I had that confused. Now, there's a report of his main speech at the Communist Academy. It's only in Russian. It's not even in German. But I'm going to rely on a good paraphrase and some selected quotations provided by Levina Kristeva from Stuttgart. She's a very careful scholar on the history of psychoanalysis, and fortunately, she's perfectly fluent in German, English, Russian, and her own Bulgarian. I mean, she's a very interesting person. Briefly, Reich's main argument in the lecture he gave at the Communist Academy is that psychoanalysis must be seen as a natural science, and as such, must occupy an appropriate place in the worker state. He referred to idealistic deviations, quote, in psychoanalysis, the kind that lead to Freudism. He voiced hope that there would be further discussion of psychoanalysis in the Soviet Union, so that psychoanalysis could be purified, it's a quote, from any bourgeois influences. His lecture was criticized by Sapir, Zolkin, Friedman. These were all former advocates of psychoanalysis. Sapir claimed that even though Freud had made some important contributions, these quote-unquote grains of truth had to be integrated into a genuine Marxist psychology. As for Zolkin, his reaction wasn't totally negative, but mostly it was, and it's clear that Wright didn't like this guy at all. In an archival document from 1951, he refers to Zolkin as a priest in communist frock. And in The Sexual Revolution, he says of Zolkin, he's one of the camp of sexually warped intellectuals, revolutionaries due to neurotic motives who only cause confusion. And then in The Sexual Revolution, he does a 5-page critique of Zolkin's analysis of sexual education among young pioneers. Svigda Katov. You understand what I said?
Always ready.
Always ready is the slogan of the young pioneers. Whatever his critics had to say, whatever social challenges he witnessed, none of this dampened his ardor, and Reich returned from Moscow energized in his communist commitments. And here I gotta say, it's a very unusual thing that he was so aligned with the Communist Party in Austria, because this party was very small and totally ineffectual. But nonetheless, he refused to go along with the Social Democrats because he saw them as, you know, billy-livered and weak and not really committed. So when Reich returns from Moscow, he was not a true believer, that's very clear. I mean, he raises critical questions. He gets involved politically, and this is a call to a meeting of, quote-unquote, the Revolutionary Social Democrats that Reich started. Note the date, 13th December 1921. As I said, Reich gave his last talk in Freud's chambers the 12th of December 1929 on the prophylaxis of psychoneuroses. And we see that Comrade Dr. Wilhelm Reich will be the main speaker, and indeed, he was the main speaker. He then hosted a meeting of the Revolutionary Social Democrats. He forcefully attacked the Social Democrats' leadership. At one point, a Social Democratic leader gets up and says, "All Social Democrats leave the room." And then someone turns off the light. Fistfights break out, chairs are flying. And you can read Wright's description of all this in People in Trouble. It's the end of chapter 4. After this tumultuous meeting, Reich then puts out a newspaper called the Revolutionary Social Democrat. As far as we can tell, I think this was the only issue of this newspaper. But he, in the spring of 1930, he spoke at public rallies sponsored by the Communist Party, urging Social Democrats to leave the Social Democrats and join the party. And Jonathan, in his article, points out in one of these rallies, he spoke to 100,000 people, which is really. I knew he spoke to large crowds in Berlin. I didn't realize that this must be in Carl Fallon's book. You know, that he spoke to these huge crowds, all sponsored by the Communist Party. And in November, this is the slate of candidates for parliament from the Communist Party. The rote Fahne is the red banner, the organ of the Communist Party. And the German says the struggle against fascism. And then there's the slate of candidates, and Peglau cleaned this up a bit. It's still very hard to see.
Isn't that those who struggle, strugglers against?
Struggle, what did I say?
You said the struggle.
Yeah, well, what you think?
Is it cancer, isn't it?
Struggle.
It's fighter, fighter,
Fighting, struggle, fighting, wrestling. Down here.
Those who struggle against.
It's not the fight, it's fighters.
Fighters.
Right, fighters against.
Fighters against fascism. Down here you can see Dr. Wilhelm Reich, physician from a particular district of Vienna. And Reich himself admits that he did run for parliament in one of the archival documents that I've seen. So this brings us to his expulsion from the International Psychoanalytic Association. I leave to another time Reich's activities in Berlin, where he moved after this election in late 1930. Suffice it to say, he remained active in Communist Party circles, both through public speaking and through writing. I conclude with a few comments about what I see as a scandalous incident in the history of psychoanalysis. Not psychoanalysis the theory, but psychoanalysis the movement. Namely, Reich's expulsion from the German Psychoanalytic group, and thus from the international group. Because if you didn't belong to one of the local groups, you couldn't be a member of the international group, apparently. All in an attempt to make psychoanalysis acceptable to the Nazi regime. And here, I mean, I've read lots of stuff, but I mentioned one article by Svi, the one he talked about, the deal with the devil to save, quote unquote, psychoanalysis in Nazi Germany. But also a very interesting article by Ricardo Steiner. And what makes this interesting is that he examines closely the correspondence between Anna Freud and Ernst Jones. Reich's political activities and his identity as a communist were of great concern to Freud, to his daughter Anna, and to Ernest Jones, especially after the ascendancy of National Socialism in Germany. Jones and Anna Freud began corresponding about Reich in April 1933. So April 1933. The Reichstag burns in February 1933. Hitler uses the burning of the Reichstag as a basis for becoming a dictator, basically, for eliminating any shred of parliamentary control. So he went from being chancellor to being I'm not laughing. I don't know what else to call him. Führer. He went from being chancellor to being the big cheese. Reich fled Berlin. Actually, the night the Reichstag was burned, Reich was lecturing in Denmark. He comes back to Berlin and he realizes they're rounding people up. He boogies to Vienna. And at the time, the letter or correspondence between Jones and Freud begin is when Reich's still in Vienna, he'll shortly go to Denmark. This is from a letter that Svi referenced, but I want you to see the whole of it. This is to Jones by Anna Freud, April 27th. And it's not about sex, it's about politics. The pronouncement of my father on this matter is, if psychoanalysis is to be prohibited, it should come to be prohibited for that which it is, and not for the mixture of politics in psychoanalysis, which Reich represents. Now, if between that, underneath that, there's sexuality, that's the whole issue, which Reich represents. My father can't wait to get rid of him, inasmuch as he attaches himself to psychoanalysis. That which my father finds offensive in Reich is the fact that he has forced psychoanalysis to become political. Psychoanalysis has no part in politics. That's translated by Steiner. Their correspondence about Reich continued even after Reich made a favorable impression on Jones when they met in London. Late in 1933, Reich traveled to Zurich, where he met Rumbacher. Thank you, Rumbacher. He traveled to Paris, where he met the Trotskyites. He traveled to London, where he met Jones. And Jones was actually quite impressed by him. Because Reich was looking, where am I going to live? But despite this, Reich had to go.
Maybe a word of group, but he started sexual politics reform in Switzerland.
Yes, yes. No, they were friends. Reich wrote his obituary in the annals of the organization.
Jones could not be trusted. Jones was notorious for liking people openly.
Let me say that, and then you can say more later. Reich had to go if psychoanalysis was to survive in Germany. He only found out of his removal from the German Psychoanalytic Society upon his arrival at the Lucerne Conference in 1934. Later, in Volume 3 of his Life and Work of Sigmund Freud, Jones boldly lied about Reich and asserted that Reich resigned. As Steve would say, bullshit. I end by repeating that part of Anna Freud's letter reporting his father's viewpoint. Psychoanalysis had no part in politics. Not for Wilhelm Reich, that is for sure. Indeed, the opening chapter of the 1930 Adolescence, Abstinence, and Marital Morality has a section called Objective Non-Political, in quotes, Science. And you can read this, it's in the Sexual Revolution again. In this section, Reich shows how all sorts of supposedly scientific work on sexology have built-in political biases. And of course, science itself is a social institution embedded in its historical, economic, and sexual context. The implications of that would be fitting for a future conference, which I'm trusting you folks to organize. That's the end of my remarks. Okay, now I timed this to be under an hour, so before we go to the panel, am I under an hour?
Yes.
Before we go to the panel, do you have any questions for me?
Right, we can ask some questions.
Any questions from a non-speaker? Native speaker, but not from one of the platform. Yes, Kevin, please.
That's a great letter there. I was just wondering if you're familiar with their other letters between Anna Freud and Jones, where she actually says to Jones, it's got to be around the same period of time that Reich is not sane.
I've never seen that, and I don't think that shows up in the Steiner correspondence.
It may not. No, this is new to me, this one.
Well, you got to see this article, Kevin. It has a whole appendix of the correspondence between Jones and Anna Freud.
Oh, okay. And I've seen some of those letters. I haven't seen this one.
Yeah.
And this is just one that I've used for my storyline, and I was surprised to see it, where Anna Freud, who Reich speaks favorably of later on, you know, where she is saying as early as this, Reich is not sane.
Well, yeah, I think the issue there was that she really, and she was very devious.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that from all accounts that she met with him the day before his expulsion, assuring him that everything was fine. And I think again it proves something about both it proves a lie about his being a suspicious, difficult. He was very open, usually very trusting. But anything sometimes sometimes naive and sometimes too trusting. One thing I would like to add to Philip's thing about why Reich went to Russia and the Soviet Union, part of Reich's fascination with the Bolsheviks, there is, as a child of the revolution, so to speak, I grew up, my first children's book, believe it or not, was My Friend Ivan, which was a story about a little boy who gets to meet Lenin. Nobody said he'd be able to meet Lenin, but he insists that he will meet Lenin. He meets Lenin, right? And Lenin picks him up and carries him through the village. Okay? There was a mythology about Lenin, having grown up as very, very much, that Lenin, was not Stalin. That had Lenin been the force of the Bolshevik, that things would have changed. It was Stalin that betrayed the revolution, etc., etc. In fact, as much as Lenin didn't like Stalin because he felt Stalin was impolite, not because of Stalin's politics or his skill as a bank robber and train robber, which was the primary value he had initially. Lenin was the one, Phil made reference to, Lenin was the one who really set in motion what becomes Stalin. The purges, the assassination, the Gulag. And Trotsky was no angel either. The guy who was interesting, was my hero, was Nikolai Bukharin, who knew Reich's work and was very Western, very, very brilliant, and very, very much saw Russia and the Bolshevik movement going very much in the direction of the Schmidts and others.
How does this answer the question of why Reich went?
Because Reich loved Lenin. Right. Reich believed that Lenin was a hero, as many did, believed that Lenin was the hero of the revolution, that Lenin was setting the world free, that Lenin was finally activating Marx.
What was Reich's motive?
Can I quote?
Yeah.
It's all said in Mass Psychology of Fascism.
Yeah.
The admiration for Lenin was boundless, never changed.
That's right.
Stalin is a different story.
That's right. And the proletariat. The proletariat somehow had some secret.
Try to answer the question, what was Reich's motive?
Kevin, I have it as a PDF if you want, I'll send it to you, the Ricardo Steiner article. And Svi and you, what was your question?
No, it's the same question the same question that Harry got answered. Why in 1929 did Reich go there? What was his
Because
motive?
he thought it was potentially. Well, he says actually in sexual. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's okay. No. Well, I tried to show you the history. I tried to show you that Reich got very interested in practical communist stuff. And what else to do but to go to the Soviet Union? Look, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, when I was a philosopher, I studied. He went to the Soviet Union. Fischer went to the Soviet Union. Many people were interested to see for themselves what exactly happened. Also, Reich was really interested in what Vera Schmidt had written about the children's school, but it was long closed. I don't think Reich was aware of what was going on in the Russian journals, which showed this decline of the theoretical interest in trying to bring Freud and Marx together. I don't think he knew about that. And I think he was a bit naive. In fact, I've already shut this stuff off, but if you go back to that report from the psychoanalytic movement, and read, Wright thought that psychoanalysis was really going to take off. And just the opposite happened. We got totally schmucked.
So he thought it would be a fertile ground for his
Exactly.
Well, he said in the sexual revolution, he talks about that in saying that he went initially thinking that this was going to be the new, and he visits the collectives, and he talks about how he comes with great expectations for a new time, a new era, and discovers that they're as neurotic and as pathological and as puritanical, if not worse.
But he doesn't say that in 1929.
Yeah, right.
He doesn't say that in 1930. He doesn't say it in 1931. He says it after he gets thrown out of the Communist Party in January 1933. Then he reissues Dialectical Materials in Psychoanalysis and adds a whole bunch of footnotes where he for the first time criticizes the Soviet Union, and then he writes the second part of Sexual Revolution. Gentleman in the back and then speak. Yes, not Tom, the guy behind you. Sir, did you have your hand up? I thought
Actually, yeah, I'll take advantage of this moment. I
Yes.
wanted to, I got stuck with passage about interpretation and why Wright had put off or been ambivalent about interpretation for 1 year, and we never really heard the resolution of that in your talk.
Now, is this...
Oh, that was from the other talk. But...
Oh, we're going to have a panel in soon. Let's just limit it to my talk right now, and then we're going to have a panel.
Oh, I just thought I would take it.
No, okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Me and then Tom.
I have a question about the quote from the function of the orgasm.
Yes, in genital strivings.
Because it's then replicated a number of times in the mass psychology of fashion.
That same passage. That's very interesting. I have this long-range project. What I'm doing is I'm recording all the changes that Reich made between 1933 mass psychology and the English version in 46. All the editorial changes, what went in, what went out. But you got to do the same with 1927 function and the 1945 version that is genitalia, because Reich is always editing his work. And that's why some of the later translations aren't quite as elegant as the Wolf translations, but they include new material. You know, and there was other reasons why the Trust retranslated material, which I do not go into, but Reich was constantly tweaking his writings. So later translations and new stuff. David, please. Oh no, David is just in the camera. Yeah. Tom, please.
What year did Wright first try to merge psychoanalysis and Marx?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. I would rather say that Reich's attempt in Dialectical Materialism and Psychoanalysis, 1929, though he wrote it in 27 and 28, what he tries to do there is to show that psychoanalysis is in no way incompatible with a dialectical materialist stance. That there is no reason for a Marxist who's really committed to dialectical materialism and not something else should be put off by psychoanalysis. And you can read that dialectical materialism and psychoanalysis in a variety of sources. And I can give you the sources if you want. I mean, you can read the English version. Yeah.
And what year did you go to Moscow?
Same year, 1929. Wright goes in September. The article appears in October. I don't know if he was still there when it was published, but he had written it in 27, 28. And then the second article, the report to the Psychoanalytic group, was in November. And then in December is when he holds the meeting of the Revolutionary Social Democrats. So in those few months, I mean, really between August and the New Year, woo, incredible amount goes on in Reich's life.
Why don't we bring the panel up? And there's something end by giving one quick anecdote. Saying, Dr. Wright to Dr. Sobey in conversation, and evidently he said this in a number of other occasions, reminded Dr. Sobey as late as the 1950s, before, just prior to his going into prison in the United States. He said, "Remember, Dr. Sobey, I remain to this day a Marxist."
What he meant by that?
Yeah.
Not
a communist.
I think he was a voucher Marxist.
Yeah.
Did he win that election?
No.
The Nazis got more votes than the communists in 1930. And, I mean, but it just says that he was caught up. I think he begins to see the reality in late 1932. There's a little anecdote. There was a journal called The Warte, The Lookout. And they published a lot of articles by Wright over his name and over other names. In The Warte, they would have a list of books that you need. And they had all Wright's books. In November, in the December issue of The Warte, suddenly Wright's books would disappear. And in the December Youth Communist Journal, Red Sport, suddenly there's an order, do not distribute Reich's books. And then in January 1933, he's thrown out of the party. But he's not just thrown out, they actually have a trial. And there's a record of his trial in his archives. He had an inside person who was recording everything for him. And it was not unanimous. There were a lot of people who didn't want to throw him out of the party, but the party leadership, acting on orders from Moscow, threw him out. And then in 1934, the Danish party published a document excluding him. He wasn't a member, but they forbade him from joining the party. And then the rest unfolds, and it's too much to go into.
You have to keep in mind that Moscow, that no local party acted locally. All orders came from Moscow.
Except for the Viennese party until 1929. Vienna was out of step with others because there was conflict within the Vienna party. And in fact, one of Reich's closest buddies, Willy Scham, ended up being the leader. When that guy came to the States, he ends up becoming a right-winger. He worked with William F. Buckley Jr. On the National Review.